Welcome back to ADHD Whiskey. My name is Matt, and today is 1 Ounce Wednesday. If you're new to the channel, 1 Ounce Wednesday is a day where I take a sample that has been provided to me by a patron or a viewer or a distillery or Larry Bird, Paige Stoyakovich, Spence Olchin, Danny Heffernan, Danica Patrick, Jennifer Love Hewitt, or anybody else who provides me with a sample. I take that sample, I pour it in a glass, I typically swirl it, I nose it, I taste it, I review it, and I score its ass. And today, thanks to Jim M. I don't want to say your full last name, Jim, because I didn't ask for permission. But Jim, thank you so much, because today is a day where I drink something I never thought I would ever get to drink. Ever. The chances of me ever getting to taste this bourbon is so little that Chuck Cowdery, the world-renowned whiskey writer, actually wrote a book about this specific bourbon, and it's called The Best Bourbon You'll Never Taste. Today, we are tasting and reviewing and scoring one of the very first bourbons that ever took off on the internet and grew massive fame by whiskey enthusiasts and bourbon lovers across this great country of ours. The bourbon I'm about to taste is supposedly one of the best bourbons ever produced. The internet's hype train started chugging along in the early 2000s and really ramped the value of this bourbon through the roof. Today, thanks to Jim M., we are drinking A.H. Hirsch 16-year Reserve. This 91.6 proof straight bourbon whiskey was distilled in 1974 and has a mash bill of 75% corn, 13% rye, and 12% malted barley. It was distilled and aged for most of its life in Schaefferstown, Pennsylvania at the Michter's Distillery. America. This bourbon was distilled and aged at a time in America when bourbon wasn't super popular. People weren't buying dark spirits, people weren't buying bourbon, so bourbon continued to age longer than it should have. Distillate like this continued to age in their oak barrels for longer than anticipated, longer than producers would have liked. But guess what? Happy accident, it turns out people ended up loving this shit. So this bourbon continued to age and age. In 1989, the Michter's Distillery met a tough opponent, and that opponent went by the name of bankruptcy. That same year, due to Michter's financial issues, Gordon Hugh stepped in and was like, hey, that bourbon, bring it on over to Huey. Enter a man named Julian. Julian Van Winkle III steps foot into frame and says, hello, my name is Julian Van Winkle, and I will take your bourbon and I will bottle it. 2 years later, in 1991, Julian bottles the first rendition, the first round, the first go at this 16-year Hirsch Reserve. Those 1991 bottles had some blue wax on top and are what some people would call very expensive if you run across one today. For 12 years, resting in a steel tank was the remainder of that 1974 distillation run. What originally was a batch of 400 barrels was now whittled down. There wasn't as much left anymore after the 1991 bottling, but in 2003, after that whiskey made a trip from Pennsylvania to Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, that same exact whiskey was bottled and sold again. Later on, the remainder of the whiskey was actually bottled into decanters, and the remaining whiskey was sold off. Finding this nowadays is damn near impossible, and if you do find a bottle of the gold foil bourbon, which we're drinking today, which was bottled in 2003. To get your hands on one of these is extremely expensive. From what I could gather, a bottle of this is gonna cost you around $4,000, probably more. The history of this whiskey from 74 to today is what makes it so interesting. It changed hands so many times. It was bottled at different dates. Julian Van Winkle was responsible for bottlings. Sazerac was even interested in purchasing the A.H. Hirsch brand and this particular whiskey. After the bottling in 2003, the internet got their little noses and palates on this bourbon, and they went wild and crazy. And they were like, hells yeah, this stuff is the best stuff. Bring us more, bring us more. It's whiskey, bitch. Gimme more, gimme more, gimme more. So the internet went wild about this stuff, and they drove the price of this bottle through the roof. This was Pappy Van Winkle before Pappy Van Winkle. This was the bourbon craze before the bourbon craze. And now it's in my hand. Now it's in my hand thanks to Jim. Jim, you awesome son of a bitch. Actually, Jim sent me more than this, but I poured it into a smaller sample bottle and saving it for later to share with somebody else. That background and history was very long and I'm super sorry. Was it accurate? Probably about 50%. But that's all I got. If I was wrong on any part of that, feel free to correct me in the comments below, but also feel free to shut the hell up. If you want the most accurate information, you can just Google A.H. Hirsch 16-year reserve, or you can read Chuck Cowdery's book, The Best Bourbon You'll Never Taste. Guess what, Chucky? Porter's gonna taste it, and as long as this isn't poison, I'm gonna live to tell about it. So, suck on that. What in the world? Unique. Wow, that's unique. This is vintage, delicious, dusty bourbon. What the heck is that? Super dark fruits. Super dark fruits. Prunes and dates. But funky ones. Funky prunes and funky dates. This is like a dated date. A date that you can't date because it's predated to a date that your mind can't equate to the correct date. The smell that I can't quite put my finger on almost smells like the bottom of a cast iron skillet. Yeah, that's what that is. Oh, sign me up for being super smart. Yeah. It smells like a seasoned cast iron skillet. Have you ever got a skillet hot with nothing in it? There's that smell of that hot skillet. That's kind of what it smells like. Yeah, definite barrel char, definite oak. I feel like the oak that is on the nose of this is much different than the oak that's on the nose of modern bourbons. This just smells like something from a different time period. Let's go in for a taste finally of this A.H. Hirsch 16-year reserve. Down the hatch. Wow. And whoa. Wow, that's crazy. That is crazy good. That is a 91.6 proof bourbon that is full flavor. The oiliness, the creaminess, the way that it just coated the entire palate and did wild and crazy maneuvers. I did a triple axle and a back handspring and stuck the landing directly on the back of my palate with delicious flavors of yum and yes. The dusty bourbon note is prominent here, but not like any other dusty bourbon that I've tasted before. This one's different. This one goes where no other bourbon has gone before, in a different direction. Just like the nose, the palate is quite different. Going back to the nose and I'm getting like a charcoal briquette. Now some savory notes are starting to come through, like a heavy charred chicken breast. That tastes like a barbecued chicken breast. That is the weirdest thing I've ever tasted. It's delicious, but it is not traditional bourbon notes to me. To me, that is wild. This is probably one of the most difficult things I've ever had to describe. This whiskey is extremely difficult to give a score to because it is way off in left field. It's super dusty and unique, but I guess I gotta do it. A.H. Hirsch, 16-year reserve, receives a score from me tonight of 9.5? 9.5? If it's not one of the absolute best things I've ever tasted, it's certainly one of the best / most unique things I've ever tasted. Having a whiskey channel sometimes is super freaking cool because not only do you get to meet awesome people, but those awesome people love the same things I do, and then they share, and then we share, and it's a whole sharing experience. We share whiskey, we share wives, whatever, and it's just like yum yum, whiskey fun. I'm gonna save the last little bit to savor myself in the privacy of my own home without a camera in front of me, without bright lights shining on my face, because I feel like that is how the rest of this deserves to be tasted. 9.5 A.H. Hirsch, 16-year reserve. My name is Matt. This is ADHD Whiskey, and like I always say, keep your head in the clouds, but your mind on research. This was a weird video for me because I actually tried to tell you a little bit about this whiskey's history, which isn't my strong suit. I did some reading, I did some listening, I poked around on the internet a little bit, and I thought that the story of this whiskey was cool enough to try to share with you. And again, if it wasn't 100% accurate, that's why I never give history. That's why I never go in depth on stuff I shouldn't be talking about. But hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it enough to hit the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up, and leave me a comment below. Have you ever heard of this stuff? Did you know about this 16-year-old A.H. Hirsch? Huh? Did you know the story? How cool is Jim? Friggin' cool as heck.